The sun beat down mercilessly on the small homestead, turning the earth into cracked puzzle pieces that crunched under Mary's worn boots. She pulled her bonnet lower over her eyes and squinted across the endless stretch of desert that surrounded her little corner of Arizona territory. The year was 1864, and the drought had been going on for 3 long months now. Mary wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and looked toward the wooden bucket sitting by the well. Every drop of water had become precious. The well that once bubbled with cool, clear water now barely filled half a bucket each day. Her husband Thomas had dug it deeper just last month, but even that hadn't helped much. She remembered the lush, green valleys back in Missouri where she grew up. There, water flowed freely in streams and rivers. Rain came regularly, and gardens grew without much worry. But here, in this harsh land, everything was a struggle. Still, Mary had learned to love this place. The sunsets painted the sky in colors she never knew existed, and the silence at night was so complete, it felt like being wrapped in a soft blanket. Thomas had left with the cavalry patrol 4 days ago. They were checking on settlements further, north, making sure everyone was safe from the troubles that had been brewing between the army and various Indian tribes. The conflicts had been getting worse, and many families had packed up and headed back east. But Mary and Thomas had decided to stay. This was their home now, and they weren't going to give up easily. The vegetable garden behind the house was struggling badly. The tomato plants hung their heads like they were ashamed, and the corn stalks looked more yellow than green. Mary had been carrying water to them every morning and evening, but she knew it wasn't enough. Each plant needed more water than she could spare from their dwindling supply. She picked up the bucket and walked slowly toward the garden. Her chickens clucked hopefully as she passed their coop, probably wondering if she had any scraps for them. The rooster, a proud red bird she'd named King, strutted over to the fence and watched her with one bright eye. As Mary poured the precious water around the base of each plant, she tried not to think about what would happen if the well went completely dry. The nearest neighbor was the Peterson family, and they lived a full day's ride to the east. The small town of Flagstone was even further, almost 2 days away if you pushed your horse hard. She was kneeling beside the struggling bean plants when she heard it. A low groan, barely louder than the wind that constantly whispered through the desert brush. Mary froze, her hand still gripping the water dipper. At first she thought it might be one of the wild animals that sometimes wandered near the house, looking for water. Coyotes mostly, though she'd seen a few deer and even a mountain lion once. The sound came again, and this time Mary was sure it wasn't an animal. It sounded human, and it sounded like someone was in pain. Her heart started beating faster as she set down the bucket and stood up slowly. Thomas had warned her many times about being careful when he wasn't around. There had been stories of raiders and hostile Indians in the area, though she'd never seen any herself. Mary walked carefully around the side of the house, stepping lightly so her boots wouldn't crunch too loudly on the dry ground. The groaning seemed to be coming from behind the woodshed, a small building Thomas had built to store the firewood they cut from the few trees that grew near a seasonal creek about a mile away. As she rounded the corner of the shed, Mary gasped and took a step backward. There, slumped against the rough wooden boards, was a young Indian man. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his bronze skin gleamed with sweat despite the shade. What made Mary's breath catch in her throat was the broken arrow shaft sticking out of his left shoulder. The man's eyes were closed and his breathing was shallow and quick. His lips were cracked and pale, and Mary could see that he hadn't had water in a long time. Dark stains on his buckskin shirt showed where blood had seeped from the wound. He couldn't have been much older than 20, Mary thought, about the same age as her younger brother back in Missouri. For a moment, Mary just stood there, her mind racing. Everything Thomas had told her about being careful flashed through her thoughts. The neighbors had shared stories about Indian raids on other settlements. The army patrols were out there for a reason. This man could be dangerous. He could be part of a war party. He could be leading others to her home. But as she looked at him, slumped and helpless against the shed, all Mary could see was someone who was hurt and thirsty. The same Christian teachings that had guided her since childhood whispered in her heart. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that kindness was never wrong, no matter who needed it. Mary took a cautious step closer. The young man's eyes fluttered open at the sound, and she found herself looking into the darkest, most pain-filled eyes she'd ever seen. There was alertness there, too, despite his obvious suffering. His gaze moved from her face to the water bucket she still carried, and she saw his throat move as he tried to swallow. The smart thing to do would be to go back to the house, bar the doors, and wait for Thomas to return. That's what any sensible frontier woman would do. That's what she'd been taught to do. But Mary had never been able to turn away from suffering, whether it was a hurt animal or a sick neighbor. It just wasn't in her nature. She looked around carefully, making sure they were alone. The desert stretched empty in all directions, with nothing moving except the heat waves that made the distant mountains shimmer like water. No sign of other Indians or anyone else. Just this one wounded young man who looked like he might die of thirst before anything else. Mary made her decision. She walked slowly toward him, holding the water bucket in front of her like a peace offering. The young man watched every step she took, his eyes never leaving her face. When she was close enough to kneel beside him, she could see the pain and exhaustion written in every line of his features. Without saying a word, because she didn't know what language he might understand anyway, Mary dipped the long-handled ladle into her bucket of precious water. The metal gleamed in the afternoon sun as she lifted it out, full of the clear liquid that meant life itself in this harsh land. She held it toward him, her hand trembling slightly from nervousness and the weight of what she was doing. The young warrior looked at the offered water, then back at her face as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. When he reached out with his good arm to take the ladle, Mary noticed how carefully he moved, how gently he accepted her gift. As he drank, Mary watched his face change. The desperate thirst in his eyes softened, and something else appeared there. Something that looked like surprise, and maybe even gratitude. He drank slowly, savoring each sip, then handed the ladle back to her with a slight nod of his head. This simple exchange would change everything, though Mary had no way of knowing it yet. In that moment, kneeling in the shade of her woodshed with a wounded stranger, she had no idea that her small act of mercy would soon bring dozens of warriors to her door. Mary's hand shook as she held the empty water ladle, watching the young warrior's face carefully for any sign of what he might do next. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground, and she could hear her heart beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it too. But instead of any threatening movement, the man simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring the feeling of cool water in his parched throat. When he opened his eyes again, Mary saw something she hadn't expected. There was no anger there, no hostility, just a deep, quiet gratitude that seemed to reach right into her soul. He looked at her with an expression she recognized from church back home, the same look people got when they talked about miracles and answered prayers. The broken arrow shaft in his shoulder caught her attention again. Mary had helped her father tend injured animals on their farm in Missouri, and she'd assisted the town doctor a few times when he needed extra hands. She could see that the arrowhead was still buried deep in the muscle, and the wound had been bleeding for quite some time. If it wasn't cleaned and treated soon, infection would set in. Out here in the desert, far from any doctor, that would mean certain death. Mary looked around nervously, still half expecting to see other warriors emerging from behind the rocks and scrub brush. But the landscape remained empty and quiet, with only the whisper of wind through the dry grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. It seemed this young man was truly alone. She made a decision that would have shocked every neighbor for 50 miles around. Instead of retreating to her house and barring the door, Mary stood up and gestured for the wounded warrior to follow her. He looked confused at first, but when she pointed toward her front porch and mimed drinking water again, understanding dawned in his dark eyes. Getting him to his feet was harder than Mary had expected. The young man was taller than Thomas, and the loss of blood had made him weak and unsteady. She had to support much of his weight as they made their way slowly around the house. Every few steps he would pause and lean heavily against her, breathing hard from the effort. Mary's mind raced as they walked. What was she doing? If Thomas came home and found an Indian warrior sitting on their porch, He might shoot first and ask questions later. If any of the neighbors happened to ride by, they'd think she'd lost her mind completely. The stories everyone told about Indian raids and massacres flashed through her thoughts, but somehow they didn't seem to fit with this quiet, grateful young man who could barely stand on his own. When they reached the porch, Mary helped him settle into the shade against one of the wooden posts that supported the roof. The relief on his face was obvious as he got out of the blazing sun. She brought him more water, and this time he drank more slowly, clearly feeling better already. Mary went inside and gathered the supplies she would need. She filled a basin with their precious water, found some clean rags, and retrieved the bottle of whiskey Thomas kept for special occasions. Her hands moved automatically, drawing on memories of helping with injuries back home, but her mind kept spinning with worry about what she was doing. When she returned to the porch, the warrior watched her preparations with intelligent eyes. He seemed to understand what she intended to do, and Mary saw him brace himself against the post, preparing for pain. She knelt beside him and gently moved his buckskin shirt away from the wound. The sight made her stomach turn. The arrowhead had gone deep and the flesh around it was swollen and angry-looking. Dried blood had crusted around the broken shaft, and Mary could see that trying to remove it would be extremely painful. She looked up at the young man's face, and he nodded slightly, as if giving her permission to do what needed to be done. Mary had never removed an arrowhead before, but she'd watched her father remove splinters and thorns from farm animals. The principle was the same, she told herself, though she knew this would be much more difficult and dangerous. She poured some of the whiskey over her hands and the wound, causing the warrior to inhale sharply, but make no other sound. Working as carefully as she could, Mary began to examine the broken arrow shaft. She could see that it had been snapped off roughly, probably when the young man was trying to escape whatever fight had wounded him. The remaining piece was about 3 inches long and embedded at an angle that made it difficult to grasp. Using her fingernails and then a pair of small sewing scissors, Mary carefully worked at the wooden shaft. The warrior's breathing grew heavier and sweat beaded on his forehead, but he never cried out or tried to pull away. His self-control amazed her. She'd seen grown men scream over much smaller injuries. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Mary managed to work the arrowhead loose. It came out with a rush of fresh blood, but she was ready with clean rags to press against the wound. The warrior's head fell back against the post, and for a moment Mary thought he might faint, but his eyes stayed open and alert. She cleaned the wound thoroughly with the whiskey, knowing it would sting terribly but also knowing it was the best way to prevent infection. Then she tore strips from one of her own petticoats to make bandages. The white cotton fabric was soft and clean, and she wrapped it carefully around his shoulder, making sure the bandage was tight enough to control the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. When she finished, Mary sat back on her heels and looked at her work. The warrior's shoulder was neatly bandaged, and the immediate danger seemed to have passed. He was looking at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. It was more than gratitude, more than relief. It was the look of someone who had been shown unexpected kindness by a stranger, someone who had been given a gift they never expected to receive. The sun was getting lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. Mary realized that she had spent the entire afternoon caring for this wounded man, using up water and medical supplies that were precious and hard to replace. But somehow she didn't regret it. Looking at his peaceful face as he rested against her porch post, she felt like she had done something important, something right. The warrior reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out something that glinted in the evening light. It was a small piece of turquoise, polished smooth and beautiful. He held it out to Mary, clearly wanting her to take it as payment for her help. Mary shook her head gently and pushed his hand back toward him. She didn't want payment for what she had done. It wasn't something you did for money or trade goods. It was simply the right thing to do when another human being was suffering. As the sun touched the horizon, the young warrior slowly got to his feet. He was much steadier now, though Mary could see he was still weak from blood loss. He looked at her one more time, placed his hand over his heart, and nodded deeply. Then, moving like a shadow, he disappeared into the gathering darkness of the desert night. Mary stood on her porch for a long time after he was gone, holding the basin of bloody water and wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or perhaps the most important decision she would ever make. Mary woke up before dawn just as she always did, but something felt different this morning. The usual sounds of the desert were missing. No coyotes calling in the distance, no owls hooting from the rocky outcrops, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Even the wind had stopped blowing. The silence was so complete it made her ears ring. She lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the strange quiet and thinking about what had happened the day before. Had she really spent her afternoon treating a wounded Indian warrior? In the gray light of early morning, it almost seemed like a dream. But when she looked out her bedroom window, she could see the bloody rags she had left on the porch and the empty whiskey bottle sitting where she had set it down. Mary got dressed quickly and went outside to feed her chickens. King the rooster usually greeted her with loud crowing and strutting, but this morning he was huddled in the corner of the coop with the hens, all of them unusually quiet. Even the animals seemed to sense that something was wrong. She filled their water trough and scattered some corn on the ground, but the chickens barely moved. They pecked at the grain half-heartedly, their heads turning constantly as if they were watching for danger. Mary had never seen them act this way before, and it made her stomach clench with worry. As she walked back toward the house carrying the empty feed bucket, Mary noticed that her mare Belle was also acting strangely. The horse stood in the small corral with her ears pricked forward, staring out at the desert. Her nostrils flared as she tested the air, and every few seconds she would snort and shake her head nervously. Mary set down the bucket and climbed up on the corral fence to see what had caught Belle's attention. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar landscape of rocks, scrub brush, and distant mountains. The sun was just starting to peek over the eastern hills, painting everything in soft shades of pink and gold. Then she saw them. At first, Mary thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Dark shapes seemed to be scattered across the desert, but they were so still she wasn't sure if they were rocks or bushes or something else entirely. She rubbed her eyes and looked again, and this time her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The shapes were men on horseback, dozens of them sitting motionless in a perfect circle around her homestead. They were far enough away that she couldn't make out their faces clearly, but close enough that she could see the feathers in their hair and the weapons in their hands. Indian warriors, all of them facing toward her little house. Mary's legs went weak and she almost fell off the fence. She grabbed the fence post with both hands and tried to convince herself that she was still dreaming, that this couldn't be real. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became. Her home was completely surrounded by what looked like a war party. She climbed down from the fence as quietly as she could, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the rails. Every movement felt loud in the unnatural silence. She was sure the warriors could hear her heartbeat from where they sat watching. Mary forced herself to walk normally toward the house, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. She didn't want to do anything that might provoke them into action. Once she reached the porch, she slipped inside and quickly barred the door with a heavy wooden beam Thomas had installed for exactly this kind of situation. The windows of the small house faced in all directions, and Mary went from one to another, peering through the shutters. From every window she could see them. The warriors sat on their horses like statues, some holding long lances, others with bows across their laps. Their faces were painted with red and black designs that made them look fierce and frightening in the early morning light. Mary sank into a chair at her kitchen table and tried to think. Thomas wouldn't be back for at least 2 more days, maybe 3 if the patrol ran into trouble. The Peterson family was too far away to reach, and even if she could somehow get to them, what could old Henrik Peterson and his teenage sons do against this many warriors? She looked around her small home, taking inventory of what she had for defense. Thomas's rifle hung over the fireplace, and there was a box of ammunition on the mantel. She had her father's old shotgun in the bedroom closet, with maybe a dozen shells. Against 3 or 4 men, that might be enough. Against what looked like 50 or more, it would be useless. As the sun climbed higher, Mary continued to watch from the windows. The warriors never moved. They didn't talk to each other, or shift position, or even seem to get tired. They just sat there, watching her house with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Around mid-morning, Mary noticed something that made her even more nervous. Some of the warriors had gotten down from their horses and were kneeling on the ground, doing something with sticks and stones. At first she couldn't tell what they were doing, but then she realized they were building small fires. They were settling in for a long wait. The sight of those cooking fires made Mary's situation crystal clear. This wasn't a quick raid or a scouting party passing through. These warriors had come here for a specific purpose, and they were prepared to stay as long as necessary to accomplish it. But what did they want, and why weren't they attacking? Mary had heard plenty of stories about Indian raids. The tales usually involved sudden attacks, burning buildings, and people being carried off or killed. But this was different. These warriors seemed content to just sit and wait, as if they were expecting something to happen. As the day wore on, the temperature inside the house climbed steadily. Mary didn't dare open the windows for air, and the heavy wooden shutters blocked most of the breeze. Sweat ran down her back as she moved from window to window, checking on her silent watchers. By noon the heat was almost unbearable. Mary allowed herself small sips of water from her dwindling supply, but she didn't dare drink much. If this siege went on for days, she would need every drop. She also ate a few pieces of dried bread, though her stomach was so knotted with fear that food was the last thing she wanted. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Mary found herself looking at the clock on the mantel every few minutes, amazed at how slowly time was passing. The warriors never moved from their positions. They seemed to have endless patience, like hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Mary noticed a change in the activity outside. Some of the warriors were moving, but not toward her house. Instead, they seemed to be organizing themselves into some kind of formation. She watched through the front window as several of them dismounted and began walking around the circle, talking to the others in low voices she couldn't hear. Then something happened that made Mary's heart nearly stop. One of the warriors, a young man on a painted horse, rode forward from the circle. As he came closer to the house, Mary could see that his left shoulder was wrapped in white cloth that looked suspiciously familiar. It was him, the wounded warrior she had helped the day before, the man she had given water to, whose arrow wound she had cleaned and bandaged with strips from her own petticoat. He was not only alive and well enough to ride, but he was apparently the leader of this war party. Mary sank to her knees beside the window, her mind reeling. Had she been fooled completely? Had his wound and desperate thirst been some kind of trick to get her to let her guard down? Was this elaborate siege her punishment for showing kindness to an enemy? The young warrior rode closer to the house, close enough that Mary could see his face clearly through the shutter slats. His expression was serious and determined, but not cruel or threatening. When he was about 20 feet from the porch, he stopped his horse and called out in a voice that carried clearly in the still air. The words were in his own language, which Mary couldn't understand. But there was something in his tone that didn't sound like a threat or a demand. It sounded almost like a question or maybe a request. He waited for a moment as if expecting an answer, then called out again. Mary pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She had no idea what he was saying, but she knew that her response, whatever it was, might determine whether she lived through the night. Mary crouched beside the window, her whole body trembling as the young warrior's voice echoed across the desert silence. She couldn't understand his words, but something in his tone made her think he wasn't calling for her surrender or threatening her life. There was almost a respectful quality to the way he spoke, though that seemed impossible given the circumstances. After calling out twice more and receiving no response, the warrior turned his horse and rode back to join the circle of mounted men. Mary watched him go, her mind spinning with confusion. If they wanted to attack her house, why didn't they just do it? Why all this waiting and ceremony? The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, and the temperature inside the house became almost unbearable. Mary's water supply was running dangerously low, and she rationed herself to tiny sips every hour. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had freely given water to the wounded warrior yesterday, and now she might die of thirst because of the siege his people had laid around her home. As the afternoon dragged on, Mary noticed changes in the behavior of the warriors outside. They weren't just sitting motionless anymore. Small groups of them would dismount and gather together, talking in low voices and gesturing toward her house. Sometimes one of them would point in different directions, as if they were discussing the landscape or making plans. What puzzled Mary most was that none of these discussions seemed urgent or aggressive. The warriors moved with the calm patience of people who had all the time in the world. They reminded her of the church elders back home when they gathered after Sunday service to discuss community matters. There was the same sense of serious deliberation, of important decisions being made through careful consideration rather than haste. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something remarkable happened. Mary was watching through the side window when she saw several of the warriors dismount and begin gathering dried brush and small rocks. At first she thought they might be preparing some kind of attack, but then she realized they were building something entirely different. They were making a fire ring, just like the ones used for cooking or ceremonies. But this wasn't being built in their camp area. Instead, they were constructing it in the open space between their circle and Mary's house, where she could clearly see what they were doing. Once the fire ring was complete, one of the older warriors, a man with gray streaks in his long hair and intricate beadwork on his clothing, approached it carrying something in his hands. Mary squinted through the shutter slats, trying to make out what it was. The object appeared to be some kind of bundle wrapped in soft leather. The older warrior knelt beside the fire ring and carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside were several items that caught the sunlight, pieces of silver jewelry, colorful beads, and what looked like small carved figures. He arranged these objects around the unlit fire with great care, handling each piece as if it were precious beyond measure. Other warriors began to approach the fire ring, each carrying something to add to the display. Mary watched in fascination as they laid out blankets, pottery, carved wooden items, and more jewelry. Soon the area around the fire ring looked like a trading post or a merchant's display at a county fair. But none of this made sense to Mary. If these were war parties, why were they displaying trade goods? If they meant to attack her, why this elaborate ceremony? She had heard stories of Indian customs from the traveling preachers and army scouts who sometimes passed through the territory, but nothing that explained what she was seeing now. As the sun began to sink lower in the western sky, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, the activity outside increased. More warriors dismounted and joined the group around the fire ring. They seemed to be taking turns speaking, each man standing and addressing the others in formal tones that carried clearly in the still air. Mary couldn't understand their words, but she could hear the rhythm and cadence of their speech. It reminded her of the way her grandfather used to tell stories at family gatherings, with pauses for emphasis and gestures that added meaning to the words. These weren't war cries or angry demands. They sounded more like speeches or testimonials. Then something happened that made Mary's heart skip a beat. The young warrior she had helped, the one with her petticoat fabric still wrapped around his shoulder, stood up and began to speak. His voice was stronger than the others, and there was something in his tone that commanded attention. Even from inside her barricaded house, Mary could feel the power and conviction in his words. As he spoke, the young warrior gestured toward Mary's house several times. He also touched his bandaged shoulder and made motions that looked like someone drinking water. Mary realized with growing amazement that he was telling the other warriors about what had happened the day before. He was describing how she had found him wounded and dying of thirst, and how she had helped him despite having every reason to fear him. When the young warrior finished speaking, an older man stood up. This warrior had even more elaborate decorations than the others, with feathers in his hair and intricate patterns painted on his face and chest. When he began to speak, all the other warriors fell completely silent, showing him the kind of respect reserved for someone of great importance. Mary pressed her ear closer to the shutter, wishing desperately that she could understand what was being said. The older warrior's voice carried a tone of great authority, but also something that sounded almost like wonder or amazement. Several times during his speech, he gestured toward her house with what looked like respectful acknowledgement. As the speeches continued, Mary began to notice something that changed everything. The warriors weren't just talking. They were also unpacking more items and adding them to the display around the fire ring. But these weren't random trade goods. Each warrior seemed to be contributing something personal and valuable. One man placed a beautifully crafted bow beside the fire ring, its wood polished to a warm glow and decorated with intricate carvings. Another added a necklace made of silver and turquoise that caught the late afternoon light like captured pieces of sky and cloud. A third warrior contributed a pair of moccasins so finely made that Mary could see the detailed beadwork even from her distant window. As more and more items were added to the collection, Mary began to understand that she was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a war party preparing for battle. It was some kind of ceremony, and all those precious objects were being gathered for a specific purpose. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. These warriors hadn't come to punish her for helping their wounded companion. They had come to honor her for it. The display of valuable items wasn't a threat or a demand for tribute. It was an offering, a way of showing respect and gratitude that went far beyond anything she could have imagined. Just as the sun touched the horizon, the young warrior she had helped stood up again. This time, instead of speaking to his companions, he walked slowly toward her house. In his hands, he carried a small bundle wrapped in soft doeskin. When he reached a point about halfway between the fire ring and her porch, he stopped and placed the bundle carefully on the ground. Then he did something that made Mary's eyes fill with tears. He placed his hand over his heart, just as he had done the night before, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. After holding this position for several long moments, he turned and walked back to join the other warriors. Mary stared at the small bundle sitting in the dust outside her house, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had witnessed. Everything she thought she knew about this situation had been wrong. These warriors hadn't come as enemies, they had come as friends. Mary stared at the small bundle in the dust outside her door for what felt like hours, though the shadows on the ground told her only minutes had passed. Her heart was still racing from the fear of the past day, but now confusion mixed with something else she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or wonder. The warriors remained in their circle, sitting motionless on their horses as the desert sky deepened from gold to purple. The fire ring they had built remained unlit, surrounded by all those precious gifts that gleamed in the fading light. Mary had never seen such beautiful things gathered in one place, and the fact that they were meant for her seemed impossible to believe. Finally, her curiosity overcame her caution. Mary moved away from the window and approached her front door. Her hands shook as she lifted the heavy wooden bar that had kept her locked inside all day. The door creaked softly as she opened it just a crack, and the cool evening air felt wonderful against her flushed face. She could see the bundle clearly now. It was about the size of a loaf of bread, wrapped in soft leather that had been decorated with tiny beads and patterns that reminded her of flowers and stars. Beside it lay something else that made her catch her breath. It was a piece of bark, with markings scratched into its surface, crude but unmistakable drawings that told a story. The first drawing showed a figure with long hair kneeling beside another figure lying on the ground. The second showed the standing figure offering something to the one on the ground. The third drawing depicted two figures with their hands joined together. At the bottom of the bark, someone had carved symbols that looked like they might be words, though Mary couldn't read them. Even without understanding the language, Mary could see what the drawings meant. They showed her giving water to the wounded warrior, and the joined hands represented friendship or alliance. This wasn't just a gift. It was a message, a way of communicating across the barrier of different languages. As Mary stood in her doorway, studying the drawings, she heard a voice call out from the circle of warriors. It was the young man she had helped, and this time he was speaking words she could understand, though his English was broken and heavily accented. "Woman of water," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "You give life. You save warrior. Honor you bring." Mary's throat was too tight to respond, but she took a small step forward, showing herself more clearly in the doorway. A murmur went through the circle of warriors. Not threatening, but almost approving, like people in church when someone stepped forward to make a confession of faith. The young warrior continued, speaking slowly and carefully as he searched for the right English words. Many suns ago I fall. Arrow bite deep, water gone from body, death come close. He touched his bandaged shoulder. You find, you know fear, you give water of life. Mary found her voice at last, though it came out as barely, more than a whisper. You were hurt, I couldn't just leave you there. Other white woman, she run, she hide, she call soldiers. The warrior's voice held no judgment, just a statement of fact. You different. You see hurt man, not enemy. You give water when yours is small. You take arrow from flesh, you make healing. The older warrior who had spoken with such authority earlier now rode forward. His English was better than the young man's, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of years and wisdom. I am chief of these people, he said, gesturing to the circle of warriors. This young man is my son. When he not come back to camp, we think him dead. We come to find body, to fight those who killed him. But he tell different story. Mary's legs felt weak, and she gripped the doorframe for support. She had been treating the son of a chief, the equivalent of helping a prince or governor's child. No wonder they had come in such numbers. The chief continued, My son say white woman save his life. Give precious water. Take pain to heal him. Show mercy when she could show fear. He paused, letting his words sink in. This thing, it change everything. We come to see this woman, another warrior called out in clear English. We come to know if story is true. And to honor, added a third voice. To show respect for one who shows respect. The chief nodded toward the bundle at Mary's feet. These gifts, they from grateful hearts. Silver from our finest maker. Corn seeds for your ground. Medicine plants for healing. Story, beads to remember this day. Mary knelt down and carefully picked up the leather bundle. It was heavier than she expected, and she could feel multiple objects inside. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it, revealing treasures that made her gasp. There was indeed a silver bracelet intricately worked with symbols she didn't recognize but found beautiful. A small pouch held corn kernels, but these weren't ordinary seeds. They were blue and red and yellow, colors she had never seen in corn before. Another pouch contained dried plants that gave off a pleasant, medicinal smell when she opened it. But the most precious item was a small carved figure, no bigger than her thumb, made from some kind of stone that felt warm to the touch. It showed a woman with long hair holding what looked like a water vessel, and even though the carving was simple, there was something about it that seemed to capture the essence of kindness itself. It tells story of water woman, the chief explained, seeing her examining the carving. Story of mercy shown to stranger. This story we tell to our children and their children. You become part of our memory. Mary looked up from the gifts to see all the warriors watching her with expressions of respect and approval. These men who had terrified her just hours before now seemed like honored guests who had come to thank her for hospitality. I don't know what to say, Mary whispered. I just did what anyone should do. No, the young warrior replied firmly. Not anyone. Many people. They see different skin, different clothes. They see enemy. You see hurt man who needs help. Big difference. The chief raised his hand and all the warriors fell silent. We make promise now, he announced in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. This place, this woman, under our protection. Any who harm her, harm us. Any who threaten her, threaten our people. This we swear by sun and moon and sacred mountains. One by one, the warriors raised their weapons high in the air, not in threat, but in salute. Their voices joined together in a chant that Mary couldn't understand but felt in her bones. It was a sound of commitment, of oaths being sworn and promises being made. As the chant ended, the chief dismounted from his horse and walked toward Mary's porch. In his hands was a long-handled water gourd, beautifully decorated with painted designs. He offered it to her with both hands, and Mary understood that this was more than just a gift. It was a ceremony. She accepted the gourd and, following an instinct she couldn't explain, dipped it into her water bucket. The gourd held much more water than her little ladle, and as she lifted it to offer to the chief, she realized she was participating in something ancient and sacred. The chief drank deeply, then passed the gourd back to Mary. She took a small sip, tasting not just water but the promise it represented. The chief smiled, the first time she had seen any of these stern warriors show such warmth. "Now we are water sharers," he said simply. "In drought we remember, in plenty we share. This bond, it lasts beyond our lives." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the warriors began to file past Mary's porch. Each one dismounted and accepted water from the decorated gourd, drinking ceremonially before mounting again and riding back into the desert. It took nearly an hour for all of them to complete the ritual, and by the time the last warrior had drunk and departed, Mary felt like she had participated in something that had changed her forever. The young warrior she had helped was the last to approach. His shoulder was healing well, she could see, and he moved with the strength and grace of a natural horseman. When he reached for the water gourd, their eyes met, and Mary saw in his face a gratitude that went beyond words. "Water of life," he said softly as he handed the gourd back to her. "Gift of heart to heart, never forgotten." Then he too mounted his horse and rode away into the night, leaving Mary alone on her porch with a collection of precious gifts and a story she knew she would spend the rest of her life trying to fully understand. When Thomas returned 3 days later, he found his wife sitting on the porch wearing a silver bracelet and tending a garden plot where blue and red corn was already sprouting in neat rows. She told him the whole story, showing him the carved figure and the piece of bark with its simple drawings. Thomas listened without interruption, his face cycling through disbelief, fear, and finally wonder. When Mary finished her tale, he sat quietly for a long time, looking out at the desert where his wife had encountered something that most people would never experience in a dozen lifetimes. "Do you think they'll really protect us?" he asked finally. Mary touched the silver bracelet on her wrist and smiled. "I think some promises are worth more than all the armies in the world." She was right. For the next 30 years, until Mary and Thomas finally grew too old for frontier life and moved back east to live with their grown children, their little homestead remained untouched by the conflicts that raged throughout the territory. Travelers who stopped at their door often remarked on the strange sense of safety they felt there, as if the very air held a promise of peace.